Today we're going to be looking at Starry Landscape Stacker. And this is one way to reduce the noise in your photos at night. And the way this program works is that it's going to find your foreground and it's going to find your sky. It's going to line both of them and then stack them. And overall, it's going to create a cleaner image. So what you would do is you'd go out on location, take, let's say, 10 to 20 images, one after the other, and then do some basic processing and use Starry Landscape Stacker. So we're going to cover the full process today and show you how well it works. If you're on Windows PC, you can get Sequitur, which is going to do the same thing, and it's also free, which is nice. But this is today for Mac users. So first thing you want to do is take all of your images, of course, and then get them loaded up here in Adobe Bridge. Or you can use Lightroom if you want, but frankly, I hate Lightroom, so I like using Adobe Bridge and Camera Raw. So I'm going to select all of my images, right-click, and open in Camera Raw. And then the first thing I want to do is talk about which camera settings to use. And then we have this photo here. This was f2.8, 30-second shutter speed, and this was taken at 20 millimeters. And if I zoom in, you'll notice the stars do have some motion in them. And the first thing I want to talk about is the 500 rule, which you've no doubt heard of. The 500 rule states you take 500 divided by the focal length of your lens, in this case 20 millimeters, and that's going to give you your maximum shutter speed without star trails, which usually tends to be around 30-35 seconds if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens. But as we can see here, we still have star trails. So I personally don't recommend the 500 rule at all. I would personally do the 300 rule. So it's the same principle, 300 divided by the focal length of your lens, and that'll give you pretty sharp stars. And that's what I've done in this image here. So this is actually a 15-second exposure, and obviously the image is a lot darker, but once I brighten it up, it looks fine. But when I zoom in, we can see the stars are much sharper. And that's going to be critical for photo stacking because we want to have sharp stars. That's kind of the whole point. We don't want star trails. So the 300 rule should give you sharp stars. And the next thing we need to do is edit all of our images and get them ready for Starry Landscape Stacker. So how to increase the exposure until you've got a pretty good looking photo. Also bring down the highlights that we're not blowing out any of your brighter stars. And then lastly, you might want to bring up the shadows a little bit to preserve some detail there in the darker areas. Also, you want to make sure that your white balance is set to something manual. You don't want to leave it on as shot because it's very likely that your white balance changed between every photo unless you had it set manually in the camera. So I'm just going to put it to daylight. Alternatively, you can just manually adjust it if you want to do that. Either way works. And that's really all you have to do. The last thing to consider is your profile corrections here, and that's going to automatically remove any vignette and distortion in your photo. But personally, you can see we have some thermal noise coming in down here in the corners, which I'm not a fan of, so I'm actually going to leave this turned off, and I don't mind a little bit of vignette there. So that's all I have to worry about, really. Then I'll right-click on my image, select all, right-click, sync settings, and I want all of my images to be the exact same. You want to be careful here because this image here doesn't fit in my sequence. Again, this is different composition, different shutter speed. So make sure you only have the same photos from the interval. And just to be thorough here, if I go down here one by one, you can see I took each photo right after the other, and the stars are moving very slightly between each exposure. And that's why we are using Starry Landscape Stacker today, because it's going to align all of these stars, even though they're moving, and do the stacking. And it does a pretty good job, especially if you have a pretty simple foreground like I do here. So that's really all we have to do at the start of our workflow. The last thing we need to do is save all of these as TIFF files. So I'm going to right click, select all, save images, change the format here to TIFF if you haven't done so already. And then for the depth, they recommend doing 16 bits per channel. To be honest, I always just use 8, and I haven't really noticed any quality loss at all. So that's up to you if you want to be very thorough. Use 16. I don't really worry about it. And then finally, double check that you're saving this in an appropriate folder, in this case, a TIFF folder that I've created. Then we can click Save. It's going to go through, save all of our images, and now we're ready to go over to Starry Landscape Stacker. Now I've already saved them, so I don't need to worry about that. And next we'll look at Starry Landscape Stacker, and we'll see just how well it works. So I've got the free trial down here, and you can also find the free trial on the official website if you want to try it out, which is nice. You don't have to pay for it right away if you don't want to. But the first thing we're going to do is it's actually going to load up the interface to find your photos, which is nice. So you're going to want to navigate to your TIFF folder where you saved everything at, and then select all of your TIFF files. And then we'll hit open. Next, Starry Landscape Stacker is going to go through, it's going to read all of your images, and it's going to try and find where the stars are actually at in each photo. So I've been surprised just how well this works. If you saw my Starry Sky Stacker video, it took a long time. This is much faster. Although, like I said, that could be because of the computer. I did update the OS since that previous video, so it's possible that's what sped everything up. But here's our standard user interface. So we can see there's a ton of red dots in the sky, which is good. And there's really not too many red dots in the foreground, which is what we want. There are a few, so we're going to have to get rid of those. And depending on what you have selected here, you might only see a few dots. So I'd recommend putting this to many dots just to be as thorough as possible. So once you've selected many dots, we'll click on the Erase Red Dots button. And you can also change the size with the slider here. So all I want to do now is go through and remove any dots that are on the foreground, because that will screw things up. So we'll just spend a minute or two here. Thankfully, it did a very good job of finding the foreground. I don't have much work at all to do in this particular image, and I'm already pretty much done there. So you will want to spend some time here though and verify that there's no red dots anywhere in your foreground. And once you've done that, all you really have to do now is hit Find Sky. It's going to go through and it's going to create a mask similar to what we would do in Photoshop. And then this is going to show you what the final processing is going to do. So this gives us one more chance to fine tune our foreground and our sky. So in this case, I have sky selected, and I want to make sure I paint in blue over the entire sky. So there's a few spots it missed for one reason or another. I'm going to paint those in just to verify that everything has been done correctly. And everything else looks good. Depending on your image though, you might have some blue on your foreground, which you'll want to paint out. So you would select the ground brush here and then just paint over your foreground where there's some blue. And one thing that might help is that if you increase the opacity slider here, that will make the mask more blue and easier to see. That might be something you want to check out. But I'm really impressed with just how well this worked, and I don't really have any issues whatsoever for this particular photo. We're going to look at another example here when we're done with this one, and we'll see the difference. But this is a pretty easy photo for the application to work with. So once we've done this and we've got our sky and our foreground cleanly separated, all we have to do now is hit Align and Save. And when we do this, Starry Landscape Stacker is going to go through and it's going to align the stars. Remember how they move very slightly between all of our photos? It's going to line them all up and then stack them to reduce noise. And again, all we have to do is click Align and Save once we've verified that our mask looks good. And this usually takes maybe a minute to do. So I found that it's a very fast application. It works really well. And like I said, I really haven't had too many problems, if any, really, with Starry Landscape Stacker, which is nice. But again, if you have a PC, this is going to be largely the same process if you want to check out Sequitur. You're going to be painting in your sky and your foreground to create a mask like we just did. And then Sequitur is going to go through and stack all of your photos. So this is just the Mac alternative, if you will. But I would say, I've spent quite a lot of time using Sequitur. They're both pretty much on par with one another. But I do find Starry Landscape Stacker to be a little bit nicer overall. There's just a few little touches it does better than Sequitur, I would say. So once this is finished here in a minute, we'll be ready to take a look at the final photo. And what we're going to do is bring this image into Photoshop and compare it side by side with a single photo and see just how much noise reduction was actually done. Okay, so since we are using the free trial, it has the watermark applied, no big deal. And now we need to save our image. So you can choose which method you want to use, mean, median, max, or min. I'd recommend either mean or median. They're both going to produce largely the same image. One might be very slightly grainier than the other though, so I'd recommend checking both out and seeing which one works better for you. You can also save a copy of the image with a mask. Personally, I don't really see the point in that, but you might want to do that just for your own safekeeping. So I'm going to go with median for today and then hit save and just make sure I'm in the right folder again. And I already actually have this saved, so I don't have to worry about it there. And that's all we have to do. We've finished our processing in Starry Landscape Stacker. So as you can see, it's a very simple workflow. And next we're going to go through and find the image, and we're going to compare this side by side with an original photo. So I'm going to right click and open this in Adobe Photoshop, and then we'll be ready to compare both photos. All right, so I've got my composited image from Starry Landscape Stacker and also just a single frame from my sequence here on top. And we're going to zoom in and we're going to see just how well the noise reduction worked and also how well the alignment process worked. And we can see the first image was pretty grainy. Again, this was a 15-second exposure, f2.8. And if we compare that with the stacked image, you can see just how much cleaner the arch is, especially right up in here. It's almost a night and day difference there. And that's because we were stacking multiple photos and reducing the grain. Now you could do the same process in Photoshop, but the problem we're going to have is the stars here. They're not going to align well at all in Photoshop. So that's why we are using Starry Landscape Stacker. So the sky is also noticeably cleaner in the Starry Landscape Stacker image. And why don't we check out another area of the frame? Let's say right about here. And again, we see the pretty big difference overall. There's even some more detail coming out here in the arch just because we were able to remove that grain. And overall, I'm really impressed with just how fast and how well Starry Landscape Stacker works. Granted, this was a pretty easy image. So next we're going to take another look at a photo with a lot of trees in it. We're going to see how well it can handle that. But overall, I'm pretty impressed with Starry Landscape Stacker. It does its job and it does it well. And with that said, I'm going to skip most of the processing. We're just going to go right back to Starry Landscape Stacker, and we'll take our TIFF files from an image with some trees in it, and we'll see how well it can handle that. So I've got my TIFF files right here. In this case, I had, I think, like 40 photos, but I cut it down to 20. So that brings me to another important point. Depending on how many footage you have here, it might make things a lot harder for the stacking software, because you can imagine if you're taking 20, 30-second long images, the stars are going to drift pretty substantially over the course of that time frame. And that's one of the problems with photo stacking, is that the stars are drifting continuously. And while we have some time, I thought I'd briefly touch on star trackers. If you already have a star tracker, you really don't even have to worry about photo stacking. All you would do is turn on your star tracker, take a 4-minute long photo for the stars, and then turn off your tracker, take another 4-minute long photo, this time for the foreground. And then you can combine both photos. And that can be a little bit of a pain. That's something I cover in depth though in my astrophotography post-processing course and also all of my star tracker tutorial series. So if you want to learn more about that process, check those out. I also have a free video here on YouTube that kind of walks through the process that's under the star tracker blending tutorial video. But you know, that's something you got to think about, is that, do you want to do this process here where you're taking multiple photos one after the other, then you have to stack them using this application and then do your processing? Or do you want to just take 2 photos when you're on location and be done, and then you just have to blend those 2 together? They each have their own drawbacks, but for me, a star tracker is definitely the way to go, because instead of being limited to taking multiple 15-second photos, you can take a single 4-minute long photo, for example, and be done. You don't have to even worry about stacking. So my recommended option for a lot of people would just be to get a star tracker, and that's going to allow you to take much cleaner images once you know what you're doing. But for everybody else, if you don't want to go down that route and have another piece of hardware to carry around with you, or have to deal with polar alignments and all that, photo stacking is a great alternative. It's going to do more or less the same concept of adding in more light, therefore have a cleaner photo, and overall, this is a good alternative. So here we can see the same thing. We've got all of our dots, but now we have a ton of dots here in our foreground. And that's to be expected. When we have all these lights here, you'd kind of imagine that's going to pull those out. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time now and remove all of the red dots from my foreground. And also, the Milky Way here is kind of in a rough spot because it was drifting down and to the right. So that might make it a little bit harder for Starry Landscape Stacker to effectively stack everything together. Just something to keep in mind. But I've already gone through and processed this before, and I did a really good job. We'll see how well it works though here in a minute. So what you'll want to do, as we've already talked about, is just spend some time removing any red dots from your foreground. And also, like over here, I have kind of an absence of red dots, so you might want to add those in. I would personally save that for the next step though. So all I would really do at this stage is remove anything from the foreground. We can worry about the sky later. And we're almost done here. So again, depending on how much light sources you have, or in this case, there's a lot of trees that got picked up for one reason or another, that might make you spend a little bit more time with the processing, but it's still not a big deal, and it does a pretty good job. So let's just say that's good enough. We'll see if we can refine this here in a minute. So with that out of the way, I know I missed some spots. We'll hit Find Sky, and now it should create our mask. And if you missed some spots like I did, we should be able to fix that right now. So we can see we have some blue down here, and all I have to do is click on the ground paintbrush option and then paint out the foreground. So not a big deal if you missed some red dots before. You can fix it in this stage as well. The problem though you're going to have is with these trees. This is a very delicate area, and trying to create a mask can be a nightmare. And this is another thing I cover really in depth in the Star Tracker tutorial series and also the Astro Photography Post-Processing course I have. They're both the same videos, but the way it works is that we're going to use some software in Photoshop to create a very precise detailed mask around tree branches. And we've got, like, I think at this point, 4 videos on how to do it using a variety of different sample images. And once you understand the process, it'll make your life a lot easier if you do have a lot of photos with trees in them. So I'd recommend checking that out if you're interested. I'll have a link in the description. But I do have some spots here I have missed between the trees. If you wanted to, you could spend the time and use a small brush, come in here and paint those in. You can also hit the Z key to zoom in and really do this. But for me, I'm really not worried about it. I think the software does a good enough job that it won't be too big of a deal. So once you've verified that you've gotten the sky selected and you don't have any blue in the foreground, you're ready to hit Align and Save. Again, pretty simple, pretty fast process, and Starry Landscape Stacker does a great job. So once this is complete, we'll be ready to compare this with another image in Photoshop and then look at our final review. All right, now that it's finished processing, we'll be ready to save this and take it into Photoshop. So again, you can choose your method here, median or mean. I think the default is median, so we'll go with that. Then we'll hit Save right here. And then you can define where you want it to save at. I've already saved it. So next we'll head over to Photoshop and we'll compare this side by side with just a single image. Now that I have both images loaded up into Photoshop, why don't we zoom in and see just how well this worked. So here's our stacked image. We can see it's pretty noise free. There's a little bit, but not a big deal. Compared to a single frame, it's a lot grainier. And this was a stack of about 19 images. So between all those 19 photos, it really helped to reduce the grain. As I mentioned previously in the video, you do want to be careful though with these tree areas because it can cause some problems. Like I can see here, there's no stars there. There's some grain here. There's also some grain up here compared to the original photo. And that's simply because I didn't spend the time to really fine tune the mask in Starry Landscape Stacker. It's not the application's fault, just because I was lazy. But if you did spend the time, it would work very well. Also, I noticed over here, I had some of these trees blur out simply because, again, I didn't do a good enough job on the masking. So point being, you want to spend some time there and not rush through it as much as I did. But overall, I'm really impressed by just how well this worked. Again, if you're on a Mac and you don't have access to Sequitur, I'd highly recommend Starry Landscape Stacker in order to get cleaner images at night. And the way this is going to work is you're going to go out there, you're going to take anywhere from 10 to 20 images, one after the other, and then you'll be ready to do the processing that we did today. Alternatively, you could just go out and buy a star tracker, and that's going to kind of simplify things even more in a way. It's also going to really complicate things in the sense that all I would normally do is take a 4-minute long photo for the foreground, then my stars would blur out. So I would turn on the star tracker, take a 4-minute long exposure with the tracker turned on. My stars would be nice and sharp over those 4 minutes, but my foreground would blur out. Then you have to merge the two together, and that can be a little bit complicated, but I do have a bunch of tutorials, like I said, in my astrophotography post-processing course or the Star Tracker tutorial courses. So that would be my personal preferred method, just using a Star Tracker, because it really does allow you to take cleaner photos at night. But if you don't want to go down that road, and I know quite a few people who don't want to even deal with that, that's totally understandable. So for everybody else, if you're on a Mac, you don't want to get a Star Tracker, Starry Landscape Stacker is your best way to get cleaner images at night. And all you have to do is just take a couple more photos than normal, stack them, and as you can see, it does a great job. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. And that's about all I have for you today. So I hope this video cleared up just how well this application works, and it gives you an alternative, for those of you on Mac who don't have access to some of the applications that we do over on PC. I think you'll really enjoy this. So that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching.